Hello, you're very welcome to a discussion on the Boundary Commission. My name is Brian Feeney. Um, my career was as a historian. I've written a few books on the period 1910 to 1922. Now I am a political columnist for the Irish News newspaper in Belfast. I'm joined by Margaret O'Callaghan, Mel Farrell, and Tim McMahon. And I let them introduce themselves and their achievements in turn. So, Margaret.
Hi, I'm Margaret O'Callaghan. I'm a historian and a political analyst, and I teach at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's. I'm interested in British policy towards Ireland, and I have published an article on the policy of the Dublin government towards the Boundary Commission. I've also published another quite long article on the genealogy of partition, how partitions function comparatively internationally, how ideas brought from elsewhere inflected what happened in Ireland and vice versa. So I think that's enough about me. At the moment, I'm trying to look at what Craig is doing to shore up the best deal for himself he thinks he has in 21-22.
Okay, Mel. Mel?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, my name is Mel Farrell. I'm a former Government of Ireland IRC postgraduate scholar. I completed a PhD that looked at the Irish Free State period, 1922-1933. I subsequently published 5 peer-reviewed journal articles and a monograph in 2017 called Party Politics in a New Democracy, the Irish Free State, 1922-37. And just to note that the book is coming out next year in paperback version, published by Palgrave Macmillan. So I currently serve actually as the director of the Irish Humanities Alliance, and I also teach occasionally in DCU.
Okay. Tim?
Thank you, and good morning to anyone in the States who are watching, and good afternoon to those of you in Ireland and in Europe. I'm Tim McMahon. I'm an associate professor of history at Marquette University in Wisconsin. I have spent my career looking at Irish identity. I've written a good deal on the Gaelic revival, the Irish Revolution, and in recent years on partition and the impact of partition on Irish identities, both North and South. I'm in the midst of writing a book now and have spent a good deal of time in Belfast pre-COVID, going through records in Prony, as well as in Dublin, going through the National Archives there. So looking forward to today's discussion very much.
Okay, thank you. If I could sort of give a very elementary outline of where the Boundary Commission came from, and then the others can take up from that, whatever line they choose. The Boundary Commission emerged out of the treaty negotiations that were taking place between October and December 1921. And it was suggested to the Irish delegation as a sweetener, really, to explain to them that the partition line may not be permanent, and even let them think that maybe partition wouldn't be permanent, because if there was a Boundary Commission that made major adjustments, then perhaps the new Northern Ireland state wouldn't be viable. Curiously, the original proposal for a Boundary Commission was made by Craig in a committee in 1919, when he could see what was happening, and because he was so associated with the British government, he knew there was going to be the Government of Ireland Act, and he wanted to tidy up bits along the border. And then nothing more was heard of it until the latter part of the treaty negotiations. And it seemed attractive to the Irish delegation that there would be a major adjustment, and they mistakenly believed that it would mean that Northern Ireland would not be a viable entity one way or another. I don't want to go on too long about this, but one of the fundamental mistakes they made, and that they made many, was the belief that Northern Ireland could not exist economically, that it would not be viable as a smaller unit, whereas in fact it was always going to exist because it had an exchequer guarantee from the British government. So it didn't depend on having 6 counties or 4 counties or 2.5 counties. The British government was going to in it in any case. But as we know, as it emerged, none of that happened. It should also be said that once the treaty was signed, agreed, the Boundary Commission didn't sit until 1924. So a lot of water had passed under a lot of bridges between December 1921 and November 1924. So any of the others would like to take up from that?
I'll come in if you like, Brian.
Sure.
I suppose what's interesting about partition is even this year, nobody could find a date to agree on. Well, people did in the end, a May date to commemorate 100 years of Northern Ireland. So there are all kinds of anomalies in its origins. So we're presented with this notion that partition is just a done act, but actually it's quite a complicated process over about a 5-year period, incorporating the Boundary Commission. If we go back to the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 and the opening of a parliament here by Craig in 21, well, Craig obviously thought he'd got what he wanted. He had an imperially imposed partition of Ireland. He was congratulating himself. He was relaxing. Meanwhile, I suppose most Irish nationalists had failed to take on board or were otherwise occupied. And then the treaty, I suppose, at the end of that year opens the whole question up again, because Northern Ireland had abrogated to itself, a set of functions. They're constantly putting pressure, if you look at the Tom Jones diaries, for more funding, for the specials. They're constantly trying to justify themselves. But the Boundary Commission does, yes, so the British imposed partition, but the Boundary Commission's possibility raised the hope among nationalists that it might not be permanent. And if you look analogously across Europe in that period, you'll see there are plebiscites, there are boundary commissions, there had been nationalist majorities in Tyrone, in Fermanagh, and in Derry City, in South Newry, or, south of Newry. So it wasn't entirely, absurd of the treaty negotiators to assume that the outcome could be beneficial to them. And also, I suppose, there's nothing inherent in the way Northern Ireland's established that says the British government is going to endlessly financially subsidise it. That emerged later. So just a few comments.
If I could jump in on that point, so I'd back it up even a little further than 1920. We need to remember that the Government of Ireland Act of 1914 was passed. It was law. The 1920 Act had to essentially replace the Home Rule Act of 1914, which because the accommodation had not been made in 1914 for Unionists, meant that there was this sort of Damocles hanging over Unionist psyches throughout World War I. In that once the war was over, once the peace had been established, there was going to be an all-Ireland home rule government based in Dublin, unless a reform happened. Now, the context of the war made it significantly more possible that there would be a major accommodation for the Unionists because, of course, the cabinet was completely restructured, and you actually had a conservative dominated cabinet, albeit led by Lloyd George. So the drafting of that Government of Ireland Act was itself something that was designed to get rid of the 1914 Act, which was ready to come into effect. The other point I would pick up on, and this is building off of what Margaret just said, the uncertainty of the whole period, from if you will, the time of the Home Rule crisis in 1912-14 up till after the Boundary Commission. I mean, Unionists on the ground, whether we're talking about in the northern state or the emerging Irish Free State, they really weren't sure where the border was going to be. The idea of 6 counties or 9 counties, for many, that violated the Solemn League and Covenant. And so Unionist sensibilities were violated in 1920. There's actually some controversy within the Ulster Unionist Council about 6 counties or 9. There are 2 votes, not 1, within the Unionist Council about whether or not there should be 6 counties or 9 included in the Government of Ireland Act. So this is a period of great uncertainty on the ground for Unionists and Nationalists. And the Boundary Commission, when it sits, actually witnesses that, just sort of through the statements that are being made to them by witnesses who are talking about things from the perspective of folks with a long life experience with politics in the United Kingdom.
Okay, Mel, I think you wanted to say something.
Yes, so just to come in there on the point that Margaret raised, and just to go back to the treaty negotiations, and of course, I mean, it was quite, into the treaty negotiations before the Boundary Commission idea came up, because of course, from a Sinn Féin perspective, they saw the issue as one between Dublin and London, and any concessions that they were prepared to make on Crown and Empire were contingent on the essential unity of Ireland in some form, whether that be with the Northern Parliament set up under the 1920 legislation, or in some form of accommodation with a new free state. And of course, the 2 issues for Sinn Féin in the negotiations were the extent of the sovereignty of the new state, and obviously the question of the Northeast from their perspective. So it was into November when, kind of in collaboration with Lloyd George, Griffith presented the letter which stated that on no account could I recommend any association with the Crown or the Commonwealth if the unity of Ireland were denied, which was the opportunity for Lloyd George then to go to Craig and say, well, actually, this is how far Sinn Féin have been prepared to travel on Crown and Empire. Now the pressure is kind of on Craig and the Unionists. And of course, Craig, as he had been, was completely obdurate. He wouldn't give an inch, which is where really it looked like the talks could flounder at that point, which is where the only way out for Lloyd George at that time was if he could get the Sinn Féiners to accept Dominion status for 26 counties and a Boundary Commission. So from the very beginning, this question of a Boundary Commission, it emerged quite late in the negotiations, and the problem which subsequently emerged when the issue came to be settled was the wording of the actual clause in the treaty, clause 12, Article 12 in the treaty, which mentioned the wishes of the inhabitants and geographic and economic considerations, which was the get out clause really for a status quo. So just to say, I mean, Craig's obdurate position really paid off for him right the way through, and you see that with the Boundary Commission itself then as well. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Could I just add something to what Mel has said there? I mean, what Craig managed to extract through that Government of Ireland Act is extraordinary, because it is an act for the partition of Ireland. It's radically different to what happened in 1914. It's a serious proposal. It's 2 devolved administrations. I mean, in fact, at the time of the treaty, he's looking to be a second dominion. So it's a radically new way of conceptualizing everything to do with Ireland. It is imposed. It's done without any nationalist consultation, and it's a fait accompli by the time Lloyd George turns to deal with Dublin. So it's just so interesting that all of that Tory and liberal unionist support that Irish unionism has had works right through for them.
Can I just come in there as well? It was further complicated, of course. The Tory conference was taking place in Liverpool on the 17th of November, and there was a widespread, there was a motion before the conference basically, to end these talks with Sinn Féin. So Craig, when the issue came on his desk, so to speak, he was kind of playing for the fact that the Tory members of the coalition were going to come under intense pressure from the diehards. So he kind of, any card he had, he played it very well from his perspective.
The other thing that I would say, I'm sorry, Brian, go ahead. I'll let you talk, Brian.
Okay, no, it's just arising out of partly what Margaret said and Mel. There's a double imbalance where Craig was so closely associated with the Conservative Party and senior figures in the Conservative Party go right back for 10 years. And he'd been a junior minister. He played a role in the government. He knew all these people. He dined regularly in the Carton Club. And the idea for the Government of Ireland Act, and as Margaret said, in fact, 2 states, if you like, that idea was promoted really by a committee chaired by Walter Long, who had been a senior figure in the Conservative and Unionist Party. So there's a huge imbalance there where there's no nationalist representation to speak of, after 1919. And so the Conservatives had it all to themselves. They could do what they liked. But the second imbalance was Sinn Féin and the leadership of Sinn Féin had no Ulster policy. They had no senior figure from the north of Ireland at any of the top places. And when a delegation came from Belfast, January 1921, saying, look, there are going to be 2 elections. What do we do in these elections? How do we respond to them? And De Valera and Collins had no idea. It took them nearly a month to come up with a response. What way do we fight these elections? Do we recognize the northern state? What do we do? They had no idea. And the same applied when it came to the negotiations. There was virtually no input from any Sinn Féin people in the northeast, and the Devlinites were excluded by Collins in particular. So they had no input either. And really what happened was that it was Sinn Féin with no policy on Ulster, negotiating blind in November and early the first 5 days in December. And when they're presented with a prospect of a boundary commission, which may mean that Northern Ireland state collapses, they say, yeah, we'll take that.
So just to follow up really quick on Margaret's point too about the innovation of 1920 and your point there, Brian, on the imbalance. Think about the difference between the partition proposal that was put forward in the midst of the war, in the wake of the Easter Rising, and the one that comes in legislation. The 1916 proposal to partition the island would not have created a parliament in Belfast.
No.
It would have been still directly governed from London. And in that sense, the Sinn Féin position of 1920 might have been more understandable because you wouldn't have had that third entity already existing, which complicated the negotiations still further in 1921. And it's already working, right? Because Northern Ireland has started to function in 1921 before the negotiations begin. So it's an entirely different dynamic that's going on in those rooms.
I just reinforce this absence of input from the Northeast, from any kind of Sinn Féin people in the Northeast. I mean, one of the best illustrations of it was that when the negotiations were taking place for the truce in July 1921, of all days that they decided that the truce would take place, it was going to be the 12th. And I mean, no one in Sinn Féin in Dublin had the slightest idea, obviously, the mayhem that was going to result, because the Unionists immediately thought, right, it's a truce. We've been sold out. They're going to recognize the IRA. We're going to absolutely wreck the place. And the result was an enormous rioting from the 10th of July, really on or off until the 15th in the Belfast area.
Well, I suppose the scale of deaths in the north between 20 and 22 is something that we don't often talk about. You know, if you look at Una O'Halpin's recent book, looking at the dead of the Irish War of Independence, it doesn't go up to the end of 1922. So the scale of deaths, primarily of Northern nationalists in that period between 20 and 22, is something we haven't really taken on board. And I suppose also, if Northern nationalists are half forgotten, Irish Unionists are not in a great position in 21 either.
Just on the deaths in the north, I've just had a book published as part of a series of the Irish Revolution, and it's the county series. And my county is Antrim, which includes Belfast, and it was published in July by Four Courts Press, available in all good bookshops and also on Amazon. Anyway, there are, between 1920 and 22, the summer of 22, there were about 455 people killed in Belfast. Not dealing with killings in County Antrim or Lisburn or whatever. And about 60% of them were Catholics. I mean, there were all sorts of representations made to Craig about this by Collins in the meetings they had and so on. But in many respects, what happened in negotiations was paid for by the Catholics of Belfast. And the Bishop of Honor, Dr. McCrory, said that they were suffering vicarious punishment for the activities of their co-religionists in the border areas or in IRA campaigns and so on.
A young scholar called Nadia Dobryanska has done some really interesting work on Weaver Street killings in Belfast, but also on the representation of those killings by Craig at that time. Because, I mean, Craig is in quite a lot of danger between January 22 and the summer of 22. I mean, I'm trying to go through these files at the moment, but London are getting quite wary about where he's going. So it's quite interesting that whole episode in June 21, leading from, Pettigo, Balik into the Irish Civil War, that period almost saves Craig. So so everybody kind of does Northern Ireland. There's a huge big picture of Carson outside the Parliament, but Craig is an incredibly crafty operator, and he's very skillful all through 22. When Michael Collins is trying to support various different attacks on the newly constituted Northern Ireland.
You're mentioning the Weaver Street, just for clarification for people who aren't aware of it. That was a Weaver Street bomb. Weaver Street no longer exists. It was a small, tight cul-de-sac area off the Shore Road in North Belfast, where there were a lot of mills around, and a bomb was thrown which killed a number of children who were playing in the street, and there was a huge uproar, telegrams to the government and so on. Now, the thing is, the danger is we are now starting to talk about incidents that happened between 1920 and 22. I'd like to get back to the Boundary Commission and what was being talked about and when it was established and exactly who was involved in it and so on. So does anyone like to deal with the actual mechanics of it?
Can I just make one point just before we get to that point, which was, of course, Collins and Griffith wanted plebiscites based on the 1918 constituencies to let the people along vote themselves in terms of where they saw their future, which jurisdiction. And the other point I just wanted to make, if you talk about the passage of time from the Government of Ireland Act to the treaty, well, then you have to look at the passage of time from the treaty onwards, because 10 months after the treaty is signed and everybody involved in signing the treaty are all gone, and Collins and Griffith are dead. Right. Lloyd George's government has collapsed. So you now have an even more unfavourable position in London. You have, obviously you have a lot of political instability follows in Britain, but you have initially, Stanley Baldwin, Bonar Law, Ramsay MacDonald. You have a very different set of circumstances. And all the while that this is happening, you have not just a civil war in the Free State, but you then also have more time has elapsed that Craig has been governing the existing 6-county area. And I think that that point has to be made before you even get to look at the setting up of the boundary commission.
Just on your point about plebiscites and the data that would be used in the plebiscite, the officials who were involved in the boundary commission were very knowledgeable about plebiscites that had taken place, but so were the British. And the actual wording of the boundary commission clause, Article 12, contains wording that is very similar to the plebiscite in Silesia, except for one little phrase, because when it said it would be plebiscites by the communities, the words missing in the boundary commission are as shown by the vote. That's not it. That's not in Article 12. But the rest of it is very similar to the wording of the plebiscite in Silesia.
What's interesting to me about that too, Brian, is that in the context of the negotiations themselves, and again, this is the Tom Jones Diaries talks about this. I mean, like Collins and Griffith in particular is using words like plebiscite. I mean, it's like, so this is rattling around in the heads of the Sinn Féin negotiators that something along those lines is going to happen, but the wording, as you say, of the clause is the out, ultimately, so that there doesn't have to be a plebiscite. And it ends up, so much is in the hands of the commission chair and his interpretation of the wording, that, the question then is, the expectation that entire counties or swaths of land would be moved. On the Sinn Féin side, that belief, he's merely interested in what he calls rectification.
Yeah,
right.
But is there a possibility? Is there a possibility, Tim, that because things happened as they did, we don't give to that past another future it might have had? So Absolutely. That there are people, maybe Collins and Griffith had legitimate reasons for assuming there could be a more dramatic outcome. And I suppose also because the way things happen, everything's closed down in 1925. The report of the Boundary Commission is suppressed. The papers that I used to write the article on what the Southern government did had been missing. They were found in about 1999 or 2000. So the archival material, and what's quite interesting is the amount of trouble that, and Mel knows more about this than I do, but the amount of trouble that the Free State government went to. They had, John Millington Synge's nephew, they had people like Kevin O'Sheil. They had a huge, big apparatus attempting to make a case. So, we now know it failed. It didn't happen. But I think we've got to be a bit more careful and realize that it may have seemed like a very real possibility to many people at that time. Though most historians now kind of say, oh, well, it was never going to happen. I'm not so sure.
Right now, let me compel people to talk about the establishment of the commission, who was on it, what it did, why did it take so long, why did it not emerge for a couple of years when, as you've described, many things happened, people were dead, governments changed.
Because Tim will probably be better than me on this, because Craig didn't want it, and Craig blocked
Craig very much didn't want it.
Craig delayed it, really, didn't he, into 1924, really?
Yeah.
Right. He definitely dragged things out. I want to give Mel a chance, though, because I think part of the design of the clause was that there would be the three representatives on the commission, and that's part of the way that Craig is able to delay things. But I also want to relate Clause 12, which is the operative clause for the Boundary Commission, to Clause 11, because Clause 11 matters a great deal. The British government in the negotiations does still have the prospect that the Northern government is, if you will, secondary to the Free State government, unless they deny it. And if they deny it, that's when the Boundary Commission kicks in, and that's 11 to 12, and I think that really matters. So,
no, I'm actually glad you made that point, because originally the British wanted it to be a 12-month period in which the Northern Parliament could opt out of the Free State, and Collins and Griffith pushed for the Ulster month.
We've lost Brian for the moment, so we're
riot now.
The three of us are let loose.
If you just keep going, Mel, this is the...
Okay, yes, so I think the point Tim made the point very well about Article 12, or Article 11 and Article 12. And Margaret, I think you were making the point about Craig again, as we saw in the
He won't appoint a commissioner. Yeah. He refuses to play ball. There are extended legal ways around it. There's constant government. Kevin Matthews' fantastic book on how the policies of British governments in this period towards Ireland are really about themselves and not Ireland, is a very important book and borne out by recent events. But so I suppose it's not until 24 that Fisher, who's former journalist, Northern Whig, he's appointed by the British government on behalf of the Northern government. And then Feetham, of course, is a pal of Lionel Curtis's. He's out of Alfred Milner's New Plans for the British Empire / Commonwealth in the 20th century. These are all the people who are around the round table. So they are all imperialists for a new age. And that's what Feetham is out of. And we actually do kind of now know, which I didn't know when I wrote this article, that Arthur Balfour, with the help of Dawson, the editor of the Times, they do mark Feetham's card. They say, look, chappie, you may have got this wrong. We meant minor adjustments. We didn't mean major adjustments. Well, nobody really knew what they meant because it was ambiguous and ambivalent. But there's a propaganda war fought between 22 and 24 for the interpretation of those clauses. And on the British side, there's a constant statement that, of course, it was only meant to minorly readjust boundaries.
Right, and the Free State is doing all that it can to promote the broader, the bigger change. Whether it's creating their Northeast Boundary Bureau, which collects data and promotes the vision that the Free State has, whether it's trying to press the case against Westminster and quote the negotiators back to themselves later on. Birkenhead figures quite extensively in this. Oh no, you did mean more than just the minor adjustment. It is. It's a propaganda war, and in that situation, of course, I think it's fair to say that the British have an advantage in part because they've got more and louder voices. But I think that your point, Margaret, that the Free State was taking this incredibly seriously. The moment that the Constitution of the Free State is endorsed, both in Dublin and in London, that's when that Ulster month kicks in, and you see in the Boundary Bureau papers that they are trying to get people on the ground ready to make the case within a month. They didn't even have to wait a month, though, because the Belfast government said, we don't want to opt in. We want to opt out. They did that the next day. They didn't even take their month. And so that, from the Free State perspective, is supposed to begin the process. And that's when the delay begins. That's when that hard delay that you were talking about earlier from Craig kicks in. And the dynamic of British politics being in disarray and multiple changes of government over the course of just 2 years.
And he's busy, Craig. He's busy dismantling PR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So a lot of those apparent nationalist majorities are rendered invisible within almost 5 years. So it's just, and also, I suppose Craig has one focus, the Boundary Commission. The Commonwealth government have a lot of focuses. They've got the Civil War, you know, they've a lot, they're operating on a number of fronts, whereas Craig knows the threat he's facing is the Boundary Commission, and that's what he knuckled down and keeps at for the next few years, I think.
Absolutely, and I think as well, the expectation in nationalism, North and South, pro or anti-treaty, was that this Boundary Commission was going to make awards to the Free State. There was no conception that it might suggest awards in the opposite direction. And I think that's why, you know, the question of partition doesn't feature so prominently in the Dole Treaty debates, with the exception of obviously Sean McEntee. So there is a huge expectation of nationalists of all hues that this Boundary Commission is going to result in positive changes. But as you've outlined, the reality was that Craig, you know, Craig's kind of, if you want, his difficult posture that we'd seen previously was again working in the background on that score.
And it's on his ground, I suppose. It's on the ground of the territory he's operating in. Do you know what I mean? It is all in the Northeast.
And he's making
it's familiar territory.
Right. He's making that case as well in a series of tours in the early 20s, where he's going essentially to what you might call the border outposts and bucking up the spirits of the special constabulary who feel under threat. This begins in 22, but he does this on an annual basis. And these border tours actually get a great deal of publicity at the time. And the message is always the same: what we have, we hold, not an inch. And in the midst of the Boundary Commission sittings, when they're meeting with witnesses throughout the spring of 25, that's when there's also an election, a storm on election called, and that is the very slogan that he uses, not an inch, to argue the unionist case. So he's keeping that "what we have, we hold" mantra in the public eye while those commissioners are on the ground and taking their evidence.
And Tim, I suppose the other thing is Northern nationalists are so divided. If you are in West Belfast, what use is it to you if Fermanagh and Tyrone suddenly are in the Free State? You are an even smaller minority within this new Northern Ireland. So there are vastly different sectional interests depending on demographics for nationalists in the North.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
For unionists in the border counties, and for, you know, it could be applied all over Ireland for different minorities, but yeah.
Brian, you were trying earlier desperately to get us to talk about the commission itself. While you were offline, we took care of all of that. No, Margaret was laying out the backgrounds of some of the commissioners for us, and she talked about Feetham, who was the chair of the commission, and also J.R. Fisher, who was the representative for Northern Ireland. The one piece that we didn't get to was Owen McNeill.
Yeah.
You know, so here is a member of the Free State cabinet, the founder of the Irish Volunteers, if you will, or one of them, nominally, and a founder of the Gaelic Revival, the Gaelic League, who is in the cabinet, but he's a Northern Catholic. And I think this was the key to why Cosgrave believed he should be the representative, because he was from the North. He had the nationalist credentials going back. But what they hadn't anticipated was that he was pretty much a listless figure in the commission's sittings. There are points where he gets very dynamic in terms of cross-examining some of the witnesses, but much of the time he's sort of quiet. And you know, for years he had suffered from sort of bouts of being tired, listlessness, as they said. And he was trying to serve on the commission and go back to Dublin for cabinet meetings. So he was not, if you will, fighting their corner so much as acting as a judge, and didn't. I don't think he quite recognized Featham's design on the commission until too late.
Yeah, if I could just step in there just to say, Owen McNeill, obviously, the Boundary Commission ended his political career, but in 1924 he was still a highly respected figure. He was actually president of the Cumann na Gael Party, Minister for Education, as you've outlined. He was a figure who was looked up to as an academic, etc., and his track record and all of that. I would also just want to make the point, there are echoes here in the autumn of 1921, in that volunteers to go ahead and represent the Free State weren't exactly forthcoming either. And I think maybe there's an element there that really he was the only one that could be got to be the representative as well. I think people knew this was going to be in public, and the posture was one of, well, the Free State is going to gain northern territory from the Boundary Commission. But I think inside the Cumann na Gael cabinet, they knew that this is going to be a very difficult undertaking. And I want to also make the point that Cumann na Gael had pretty much been in perpetual crisis since the end of the Civil War, because you had the demobilisation of the army in late 1923. Then you had the army crisis, which cost two ministers, Richard Mulcahy and Joe McGrath, their cabinet positions. So Cumann na Gael is actually quite weak in 1924. And of course 9 TDs resigned from Cumann na Gael over the fallout of the army crisis. So you have 9 vacant seats, 9 by-elections due in March 1925 as well. So really Cumann na Gael as an entity isn't in a strong position by the time of the Boundary Commission. People have their views about Owen McNeill's performance, but as I say, I think he was going to be outvoted 2-1.
Do you think it's a complete hospital pass? Yeah,
I do. I do.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I see it as now. I think
his son had just died on the irregular side as well, hadn't he?
Yes,
and he did have. I mean, he is a very interesting figure. But Alice Stopford Green, at one point when he's supposed to be working with Hobson, gives out about how he could be overcome by a kind of lassitude, which I think is what you were talking about. He's also really honourable. He doesn't tell anyone anything that's going on because they've agreed among themselves. But we know that Fisher is writing everything. Craig knows what's going on day by day. So he's got a tremendous advantage.
Exactly. I would just say McNeill was heavily criticised in the Clare constituency as well for being too aloof and for not being a constituency politician or not being and they heavily criticised him then after the Boundary Commission debacle as well. So you're just kind of filling in little aspects of his character there, I think.
Also, there's weird stuff on northern policy, is there? Because Blythe, after Collins dies, Blythe seems to get into a very strong position in relation to the north, doesn't he? Ernest Blythe, so.
Well, and he's got, in addition to his own experience, his own life experience in the north, having grown up there, but he had contacts across what was Northern Ireland already. So much so that even, like priests who are witnesses before the Boundary Commission are regular correspondents with him. And he is warning cabinet that they are misinterpreting the mentality of Northern Unionists. I don't think that McNeill is taking on those warnings, but Blythe is not shy about sharing them by any stretch. So
what's he saying, Ted?
Well, I mean, he's essentially saying that what they need to do is they need to build a southern state and make it more appealing to Unionists to come in, and that would be ultimately more effective than trying to press a case for breaking up Northern Ireland dramatically. So it's a really interesting point, but. His correspondence among the witnesses, though, are also making clear to him that as they're being interviewed by the commission, this is especially true in Fermanagh, the witnesses are all picking up on the fact that Feetham is not going to hand over Fermanagh, that he's going to, if there's going to be any exchange of territory, it's going to be very minimal and it's going to work in both directions. And the witnesses are picking up on this, and they want to make sure that Cabinet's aware of it. Cabinet, I think, was aware of it already, because Feetham told people like Milroy as early as 24 that he was only interested in rectification. So I think part of the press from the Free State in 25 is to try and get as much as they possibly can, knowing that the head of the commission is not interested in a lot of territory moving.
And can I just ask, just as you were talking there, something came to my mind. When Fisher was appointed, didn't somebody write to him basically, England expects?
Well,
I think Craig kind of let him know.
Yeah, I think there was somebody on the British government, on the British side as well. I'll have to double check that. I can remember that basically, like, England expects.
I don't recall that, but that does sound interesting to me. I know retrospectively it's interesting. Lady Craigavon writes in her diary years later that when Churchill, I'm blanking on which book it was, but when he was writing in the late 20s, he actually sent Craig a draft of a chapter where he basically says, "We've been in this together from the beginning, and I want you to check the details to make sure that I'm right on all of this." And so I think this goes back to the point that Brian made very early on of the advantages unionism, specifically the Northern government, had with the British government, that the ties were so tight. I mean, Margaret, you know, when Pedigo is going on, there's a period there where Craig is actually in England. He's pressing for more guns. He's pressing for more intervention. And this is his, you know, like, he's going over and not just working the parliamentary circuit and going to dinners with members of parliament, but he's giving interviews so that the British press is aware of his stance and his need to hold the ground.
He's incredibly active. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's a dinner that Craig's wife with Church in about March 1922, where later she recorded the Church said to not to worry about this boundary commission. If it ever happened, there would only be very minimal changes. Northern Ireland would remain as it was. And
that's the official line.
Craig himself, just as Tim was saying there, the latter part of the Boundary Commission, Craig had written home saying he was very busy. He was dining every night in the Carlton Club, and he was meeting all sorts of and if he wasn't there, he didn't know what would happen in the outcome of the commissions. It's the very close association between the Ulster Unionists and the Conservatives. After all, it was the Conservative Unionist Party.
Yeah.
He claimed he made a mistake during the treaty and he was insufficiently vigilant, and he wanted to make sure he never made such a mistake again.
Yeah, right. Just I've been missed. I heard you talking about McNeil, and I probably missed what you had. So if I over stuff, then stop me. But you know, for Northern nationalists, McNeil was an absolute disaster. You know, pathetically out of his depth. He didn't realize that he was carrying out a political function during the Boundary Commission. He didn't do it. He regarded himself as to the mission rather than the government appointed him. And he simply stole the pass. I mean, the guy just was not at the races. And, you know, he has no political nous whatsoever. I mean, when it goes back to 1915, 1916, Owen McNeill seems to be the only person who didn't know that he wasn't in charge of the volunteers.
Well, we kind of said that perhaps he got a hospital pass by being appointed as the boundary commissioner.
Well, he said he did it because no one else would do it.
Yeah.
But then,
okay, but that does perhaps suggest that they did, by that point, have a fair idea it wasn't going to go in their direction, doesn't it?
Yeah. But Cosgrave said, that he appointed him because he was a northerner, he was a Catholic, and he fulfilled those criteria. Of course, he was born North Antrim didn't mean he was a northerner of the north for so long, for decades. But the guy had no political nous at all, and he just didn't cop on what was coming down the line.
It's quite interesting. Tim would probably know more about this, but such accounts of McNeill as we have are written by Tierney, who I think was his son-in-law. So, do you know what I mean? They're kind of within the family. But there are very extensive McNeill papers, but I don't know. I've never come across really anything much that he kept during the Boundary Commission. I mean, it's a puzzle.
There are some interesting papers that are in his UCD archive, including some memoranda. So just so I raised this point before, Brian, when you were on and off, but he actually was trying to pay attention to what Northern nationalists were saying. I don't want to. I would push back a little bit on what you were just saying there. So while his adult life was Dublin centric, really from the time he moved down to be a clerk, he still had family in Antrim. He regularly went north. He had ties to Bishop Henry for stretches of time, and in the 1918 election, he won the constituency in Derry. So he saw himself very much as a representative of Northerners. Now, that doesn't mean that he was effective at it.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you look at memos that he was writing in cabinet, some of which are in these UCD papers, he's paying attention to what they're saying in 1922 and in 1923. And he actually makes a significant point that we've not touched on, but I'll bring it up here. And that is that we're talking about these things as if they are in discrete boxes. The treaty negotiations, the bill, the Boundary Commission. None of these things was in a discrete box, and they were not seen as being in a discrete box by anybody who was living at the time. And I think one of the mistakes, maybe historiographically, that we have made over the years is to talk about these things as if they are the War of Independence, partition, the founding of Northern Ireland. Part of what we need to do is put ourselves into the mindset of people who were living in the 19-teens and 1920s, for all of whom this was an open question, what was going to come. I think this is part of the reason why Craig himself is so active in this period, because really up until the draft of the commission comes out in the autumn of 1925, he's still worried about what's going to happen. Because the powers of the Boundary Commission are so extensive that if that report becomes public, whatever is in it becomes the law. I mean, that had been established in the Judicial Commission of the Privy Council. So basically, if that thing becomes public, it's land shifts.
Yeah. That's what he was writing, saying that he was dining every night in the Carlton Club, and he was meeting all these MPs. He was working he took it very, very seriously from the very beginning. I mean, he abolished PR. He gerrymandered the council areas in Tyrone and Fermanagh so that nationalists couldn't have a majority of those councils. And one of the best pieces of evidence about how Sear took it, establishing the Silent Valley Reservoir, so that would fulfill the economic criterion for putting Newry, South Down, and keeping it as part of Northern Ireland, because they'd say, look, economically, Belfast depends on this reservoir, Silent Valley. Look, we've done it, cost a fortune. But he was taking it very seriously. Now, he could do that because the Unionists were united. Northern nationalists were absolutely not united. And they hadn't been throughout the whole of the decade, because for a substantial majority in Belfast did not support Sinn Féin throughout the period. Only after 1918 and the beginning of the killings in 1920 was there any sort of move towards Sinn Féin. But for tens of thousands of Catholics in Belfast was their source of living. It was their guaranteed job and in textiles. Whereas people in the border areas took a totally different view from the Catholic population in Belfast. I mean, when De Valera stood in West Belfast in 1919, he got slaughtered. Joe Devlin got more than twice as many votes. So there's a huge division among Catholics, even after the treaty in 1922, and even after the Boundary Commission. The Irish News, which was pro-Devlin, actually saying, okay, look, it mattered anyway. So let's get down and find a way to live with this new government, which was sitting in Belfast City Hall, because Stormont hadn't been built. So the east Northern Ireland was saying, look, our prosperity, our economic future lies in Belfast, so let's get on with it, because we were never going to get anything out of the Boundary Commission.
Yeah.
Tim?
I was just going to say I would qualify one of the things that you said there, excuse me, that Unionists were unified. I would say that Unionists were more deferential to a single leadership. And this again goes to Margaret's point about Craig's political acumen. He is spending so much of his energy internally in Northern Ireland trying to maintain, for instance, that there's not going to be a split off of labor from Unionists, right? He doesn't want any opportunity for his own vote to split, and so even in the period when I was talking about the confusion over 6 counties or 9, there are a lot of people who swallow hard, who want to have a 9-county partition rather than a 6-county partition, but they swallow hard and they say they're going to defer to their leaders, they're going to defer to Craig and Carson. And so you don't end up with 2 distinct parties and 2 distinct interests as you do in the nationalist communities, as you so rightly outlined. But part of that is because there is the conscious effort to maintain unity, and part of that is the sense that we are under threat. If we don't stay united, we're going to lose our territory.
And your point, Tim, about us not, compartmentalizing, the revolution here, partition there, stability there. I suppose what's also remarkable is the scale of the development of the Ulster Special Constabulary in this period, and the extent to which most of the male population is armed in Northern Ireland in that period. They are a population
most of
put in arms. Exactly, precisely. But I mean, that should not be forgotten, and that is, and I mean, we still, Winston Churchill is more helpful to Craig than Lloyd George's, for example. But I mean, we could trace in more detail. we see Tom Jones saying, I can't believe Craig is being given this. He was never promised that. He should not have these arms. He should not, but he's getting it all the way right through 22, which is fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
So, he's got a very tough state apparatus behind him.
Yeah, I mean,
he's got very tough laws.
In 1920, actually allowed to get away. I mean, effectively, what he did was set up a private army. And in 1921, September to November, he was allowed to get away with this. Wasn't a military force because the Northern Ireland wasn't allowed to set one up, and he advised he could expand the specials and say a special police force. They weren't a military force, but in fact, of course, to all intents and purposes, were a military force. They had armored cars. They were organized on a county base. They had automatic weapons. They were a military force, and they were allowed to organize and operate effectively from October 21 in contravention of the Government of Ireland Act. But as you say, it was Churchill and the who really Lloyd George. We're going to put down a motion of no confidence if you don't agree to this.
Mm. Mm. Well, it was keeping British governments in power.
Yeah.
At different times. I mean, I mean, Fanning's Fatal Path is brilliant, but Kevin Matthews' book is also brilliant, I think, on just really looking at how the Irish policy is so often so little to do with Ireland and just to do with keeping, Tory politicians in particular in power. It's absolutely fascinating.
It's strange how things have.
Oh yeah, sure.
I know. I mean, just to see how Craig's stance was kind of really got him what he wanted as well. It's very interesting. I think Kevin O'Higgins made that point over in London about the fact that in the Free State they demobilised the army. They had 7,000 or 8,000 Gardaí, and then Craig had 44,000 or 45,000 specials.
Really interesting point, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can we?
And something that differs.
Sorry.
Why?
So I was just going to say something that.
What danger was there for them? What were they reacting to?
De Valera.
Well,
what was the political impetus behind them saying, let's get this out of the way. If the British thing you want, just shut it down. We'll pay for the Civil War. We do. What was the danger for the Cumann Gael government?
Well, I think earlier on when I think you were in and out, I was talking a little bit about the crisis that Cumann Gael found themselves in. We said the army mutiny in 1924. They lost 9 TDs, 2 ministers, Richard Mulcahy, Joe McGrath, and of course somebody in the chat mentioned, what impact did losing these 2 more nationalist or more stridently nationalistic figures from the government make, and of course that had a huge impact as well, because I mean Richard Mulcahy and Joe McGrath were very much on the more aggressively nationalistic wing of Cumann Gael. Obviously Kevin O'Higgins emerges in a stronger position after the army crisis. In some respects, some historians would see him almost leading the Cumann Gael government at that point, with W.T. Cosgrave almost as a chairman of the Executive Council, which of course Michael Laffan and others would dispute. So obviously you had that internal difficulty because you see, because of these crises and the fact that Cumann Gael found itself defending the treaty and defending a sort of a status quo position, the party organisation saw the boundary question as an opportunity to kind of reorientate the party and give it a new impetus. So there was great pressure from within the party, from the backbenches, from the actual national executive, from the local branches, for to push for the Boundary Commission, push for a positive outcome, give the party something positive to focus on and have a positive result. Obviously, we said earlier, we feel that the ministers themselves knew that they couldn't meet those expectations from within the pro-treaty camp, who had accepted the treaty based on the stepping stones argument. And then, of course, in the Dáil, you have the opposition parties, but you also then obviously outside the Dáil have De Valera and the Republicans, who focused their opposition to the original treaty on the question of sovereignty and empire and crown. But now, retrospectively, if the Boundary Commission hasn't worked out, they have an opportunity now to animate or to re-emphasize the question of partition as being a failure of the treaty. It doesn't get mentioned a whole lot, but you also have the new National League Party, which is inside the Dáil, which is basically the remnants of the old IPP. And they're able to use this as ammunition against the Cosgrave government. So now really Cosgrave has inside the Dáil Labour and the National League able to attack him on the outcome of the Boundary Commission, and then waiting in the wings, De Valera and the new Fianna Fáil party, when De Valera establishes Fianna Fáil and then leads them into the Dáil. So really it's politically disastrous for Cumann na Gael. Of course, they lose 3 TDs over, having already lost 9 TDs in 1924, they then lose O'Malley, O'Byrne and William McGuinness. So it's a catastrophe really for Cosgrave and Cumann na Gael. I think you made some point about somebody made a point about the fact that if the report was actually published and people saw that territory would switch in both directions, it would immediately be implemented. So the prospect of losing East Donegal to benefit the city of Derry and not gain, we'd say, Newry, would have been. So I think that the phrase Cosgrave actually uses is we could not lose territory where people had enjoyed the liberty of the Free State since 1922 in return for limited Northern Territory. So
he also uses a phrase, Mel. He talks about handing over our people.
Yes.
So it's like people who are on that side, the right side of the border, are our people. And though the partition line's only been there for 4 or 5 years, it's like suddenly they're not our people anymore. And I wonder also, could they have done more in 25, when O'Higgins and Cosgrave, when they signed that agreement with the British government, there was some kind of a question of asking about civic rights for Northern nationalists. Could they have done more? Do they just sign the papers? Like what O'Higgins himself says, he feels like he's sold Northern nationalists. Yeah,
there were 3 options really in terms of the bargaining position that they had. The first was to press for greater protections for Northern nationalists, and obviously the one that came up then was the Article 5 of the treaty, which meant that the Free State was responsible for a portion of the British debt, which was estimated actually at between 5 and 8 million per year out of a Free State revenue of about 25 million a year. So it was actually a hugely burdensome clause in the treaty. Reading back over the documentation, I mean, you get the impression that they realise they have a strong hand in terms of accepting the status quo, that they can extract real concessions from the British. And they do talk about, they kind of reorientate from, we'll say, being with for want of a better term, the Western Ulster nationalists towards the Belfast, Eastern Ulster nationalists, for want of a very clumsy terminology, and to push for more protections for them. But in the outcome, they don't really get that. Obviously, as we know, they get the cancellation of the debt, which leaves them open to the.
Great consistently said no. I mean, one out of the whole since in 1925 was that the Irish Free State had actually no power to force Craig to do anything, and had very little or no power to help Northern nationalists at all. I mean, one of the things that the Greater Belfast Catholics hoped for, and one of the reasons some of them supported the treaty, business in particular, was that they believed it was important to have a strong government who would advocate on their behalf with Craig, with an Ireland government, and on a basis where they could negotiate for the Catholic population of the Belfast area. All proved futile, because Craig's was, look, the people in the border areas, particularly in Fermanagh and so on, are a threat to us. So any at all. But in the event, none of it happened. By 1925, Craig had really cracked down, and the repression was enormous. And in 1923, the specials had occupied West Belfast, and they had put men on every streeter. They were flying Union Jacks from the top of the pubs on the Falls Road, the Falls Baths. They had commandeered the library. The repression was enormous, and Craig just simply said, "No, we're not doing anything."
Yeah.
Mel, your point about the cancellation of the debt and relative to the size of the budget overall in the Free State, I think is really important to consider here too, because they had just made the decision to build the Arda Crusha project, which was $5 million a year. So I mean, like, that would not have happened, I would imagine, if they had been responsible for that debt.
Can I just say as well, I reread the Michael Laffan Judging Cosgrave book recently, and he quotes Cosgrave as kind of saying that when he was in London, he strongly kind of made the case about conditions in Ireland, and that, you know, we have more poverty, you know, we don't have some of these social protections, we have in taxation, uneconomic holdings, and that was kind of his priority, was to do something on the debt question.
Oh, and then there's that bizarre vignette where Craig goes to O'Higgins and says, "Look, lads, I'll give you a hand here. You can get quite a lot of money out of them."
Yeah.
Exactly.
Bizarre.
Yeah, and actually, again, somebody made the point earlier about naivety, or about misunderstanding Ulster Unionism, and I think that's quite clear here with Cosgrave as well, and with Cumann and Gael. They really felt, you know, if you run a tight ship in the Free State, eventually sort of economic osmosis nearly will kind of, they completely underestimated the cultural aspect of Ulster Unionism in that regard. But also Cosgrave felt that he was building goodwill with Craig here, and that he actually invited him down to Dublin for the horse show in 1926 to kind of publicly, but Craig didn't come. So I think, you know, again, this is a sort of a naivety perhaps on Cosgrave's part.
I think more than naive, actually, it was complete ignorance of the sources of prosperity in the north. I mean, Arthur Griffiths at one stage, this is before 1960, talking about placating unionists in a home rule government by making tax allowances for linen and so on. They had no idea that the vast wealth was from shipbuilding and engineering, chemicals, mineral water. Some of the major figures in the UV made his money out of manufacturing chlorine and so on. This was the Greater Belfast area produced 80% of the industrial production of the whole island. It was one of the most prosperous places in the British Empire in terms of rateable value in Belfast. I mean, guys, Craig himself was a millionaire, and a lot of his associates were, and that was over a century ago, when a millionaire was a millionaire. people like Cosgrave had no idea of the sources. In fact, there's a memo by Ernest Blythe, a brilliant memo where he talks about the Belfast boycott.
Yeah.
He says, look, you can banks and do all you wish, but Belfast is completely integrated in the British Industrial Revolution. I won't make any difference if you stop buying stuff in parts of the south of Ireland, because, as he said, it will have as much effect as a shower of rain on the Cave Hill. Most of the people listening to him, the Cave Hill was.
Right. It's interesting too. Yeah, you talk about Craig being in such a different social class. One of the things that was noted about him when he first ran for Parliament was that he owned a car, and that he was able to travel to various meetings in the car, and so he could do 3 meetings in a day. And this was like a revelation. And so, I mean, he was working on a different level. Of course, Lady Craigavon grew up in the palace, right? I mean, like, her father was a member of the Queen's staff when she was a child. So, like, when the Duke and Duchess of York come to Belfast and they spend part of a day with the Craig family, this is like old home week for her, right? You know, so they are operating in a very different universe in many ways than Cosgrave and others would have been, no question.
Well, they're completely stitched into the gentry here as well, aren't they?
Yeah. Craig's father left him 100,000 in cash when he died.
Jeez.
What?
Gosh.
Craig's father left him 100,000 cash when he died.
What would that be? Get your calculators out today.
It's about $1 million.
Nice.
When they were buying the weapons, when the UVF were buying the weapons, Cunningham, who was the treasurer and the broker and so on, he wrote out a check for 3 million rounds of ammunition and 100,000 rifles. He wrote out a check.
Gee.
And as I say, the commander of Belfast, who's brigadier and the grandnephew of Queen Victoria, he used to dine in one of Craig's mansions, and Craig's wife was his partner.
Yeah.
Sinn Féin had no connection at all with any of this, and didn't recognize Westminster, know where power lay.
If I could be cheeky here, I would say that that this part of the discussion does raise the question for those who think that there wasn't a social revolution in the coming to power of people like Cosgrave, that perhaps there was.
Yeah.
More of a social revolution in that transition in the 1920s than we often assume.
Yeah, it's interesting actually when you go back to the Whitehall Diary and you see some of what the British thought of the Sinn Féin negotiating team in 1921. They kind of say, well, the old nationalists, Redmond and co, they had more skill and more used to finessing a key point, and they kind of see these guys as more blunt and more new to politics and new to diplomacy and statescraft and all of that. But then, of course, even within Cumann na Gael, Kevin O'Higgins is often seen as kind of, which I don't necessarily go along with, and Jason Nirk would argue against as well. He's seen as an old Redmondite in Sinn Féin clothing. But he did make a comment about Cosgrave at one point that a Dublin corporator would make Ireland a nation once again, or whatever. So there, I don't really know what point I'm making here, but certainly there's a lot of social issues to be examined when we look at Ireland after 1922.
I suppose a kind of social revolution happened in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s. So, you can think of the whole period from 1880 to 1925 as a revolutionary period in a strange way. If you look at the utter transformation of everything through the land war, through the plan of campaign, through the alteration of the ownership of land, the change, so there is a social revolution almost before a political revolution.
Absolutely. And Tim mentioned there the ESB and the hydroelectric scheme, for example. I just know from my own family, for example, prior to 1922, they were all, farming and emigration. But by 1938, 39, I would have had people working in the ESB. So there were opportunities that come with independence,
If I could, so two things come to mind. I'm seeing we have a question in the chat that we need to get to too. But I just to follow up on that point, this issue was absolutely in the minds of people who were testifying before the Boundary Commission. If you go into the testimony, for instance, of people in South Down, one of the points that they make is that landlords in their region were not willing to bargain on good terms. So they had not actually purchased their land yet. And they're expecting that if their land is put into the Free State, they will finally benefit from land reform. This is old, if you will, home rule politics, or if you will, national politics in an arc that we assume this transition to the Republican or Free State situation, but to the voters, to the people on the ground, it's about that transformation, and its frustration. So I do want to say that, but there's a question, I guess, Brian.
On the question of the social revolution, it didn't happen on North Down and North Armagh. I mean, in Antrim and Belfast, there was one Home Rule MP, Joe Devlin, in West Belfast. The major landowners still remain major landowners. The Home Rule party didn't operate in large parts of the Northeast. In 1880, when the camp, the Unionists called the North. So the Northeast was and remained different, and you still had the landed gentry in the North Armagh, Down, Antrim, who were still the MPs, as had happened before 1885. Tim is going at the question that we should be answering about would it have been different, if there had been a plebiscite, could Ireland have been different? What would Ireland have been if the border had been adjusted? Now, with due respect to what might have is not something really very profitable in trying to answer, because it didn't happen, so we don't know.
It would depend on the area, wouldn't it? I mean, would it be county plebiscite? Would it be? Is that the question we're being asked to think about? What might have happened? What
would modern Ireland have looked like if he had been allowed to do the same? With the plebiscite like in Schleswig-Holstein.
Well, what would the alteration be? Derry City would presumably be in what was then the Free State. Newry might have been, or
I think he's also Helmer's asking whether there even could have been a plebiscite.
There could have been, I presume. There could have been.
A plebiscite, though. Is it on a city basis? Is it on townland? We're back to
all of these options were gone through at the time. They're all on both sides. Like both Craig's people and Dublin's people have projections of figures for every imaginable kind of plebiscite. So they've kind of thought it through.
how are they going to agree on what the unit would be? Would it be a county? Would it be a town? Would be
the stuff I was looking at recently is from Mana, and it's like every single little area, they've the figures minutely worked out, but that's to guard
absolutely.
against. Yeah?
Yeah,
that's to guard
absolutely.
against a plebiscite, or to be in a position to know how things would go should there have been a plebiscite.
This is one reason too why it's important to think about doing away with PR, because you know, again, what a lot of the witnesses are saying in 25 is they actually want there to be a plebiscite even at that juncture. But they're concerned that the new districts are going to be the ones that are used, and the gerrymandered districts are going to be the ones that are used, and that's going to disadvantage nationalist opinion. And you know, it's fascinating too, because as you say, they've got it down to like there are so many people who vote in this district now, and we know who they are.
Bourdion, he had been responsible for the plebiscites, hadn't he? I'm not positive. I think he was responsible for the plebiscites.
I think he was, and then they bring him over to the Irish Commission at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. It says here, if there had been a plebiscite and difference, Jennings could have pled for the Republic.
I think I know who that is anyway.
I mean, none of these.
Was it Schleswig-Holstein? Yeah.
They were never going to agree the unit, and they couldn't even agree unit the basis. That would be the majority would be the 1911, the 1918 election was. I mean, because we're back down to Article 12, the clause was so big and so imprecise. You're going to end up fighting about every interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't properly legally drafted. And you know, it's back to McNeil again. Fisher and Feetham ran rings around him because he had no legal training.
Yeah, sorry, just to point out as well, just a comment I made earlier about England expects, just to clarify, that was a telegram from Lionel Curtis.
To Feetham, was it? Or
to Fisher.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, no, to Feetham, actually.
To Feetham.
Yeah,
that makes perfect sense.
That'll be the boy.
Yeah, apologies.
So, you know, the this question of debating parish level, district electoral division, county, etc. This is, of course, what the Buckingham Palace Conference went sideways on in 1914. You know, and here again too, some of the same players involved in that are involved in 1920s, but of course that's not the case with the Sinn Féiners. The Buckingham Palace Conference was Redmond and company, so you have this sense for among some of the Unionist leadership and some of the British leadership that they're saying, we've had this discussion before, and it's like, not with us. You haven't had it with us, and it plays out exactly the same way because they're still counting the same numbers. You know?
Yeah. Right.
The bogies that people think up are quite funny, though, aren't they? Like Unionists in Fermanagh keep going on about temporary workers from across the border.
Well,
there's the migrant Southern Irish destroying the clear electoral arithmetic in various places, and that pervades the North for decades.
They're still going on about that. Can I raise?
Well, as a Southerner, I should be aware of it. I suppose residing in Nigeria.
What sort of signal did it send in April 1923? Free State government set up customs posts and actually, in effect, recognised the border as was. And secondly, giving away the Council of Ireland, the last vestige of All Ireland arrangement, which they did as part of the treaty in 1925. Anybody?
Well, I mean, the Council of Ireland does survive the treaty, doesn't it? I mean, it's going right
No.
into
Not the
He means
1925.
later.
the 25 treaty he's talking about, the
Oh,
tripartite agreement.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, you can't go back to Ronan Fanning's line on partition. You know, Ireland was partitioned by the British cabinet. And then the notion that, well, these are the ways you can put it together at the same time as we're dividing it are slightly ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? So, like, I can see the Council of Ireland has capacity, but the capacity to reunite something you're in the process of dividing is kind of tortuous to me.
Yeah.
But it goes back to. I lost Brian there.
I think he was saying sorry, go on ahead.
You go ahead. Go ahead.
I think he was saying like the Council of Ireland powers were for the Six County area were handed back to the Northern Parliament in the 1925 agreement, wasn't that it?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, I think part of this, it goes back to, and I think this is partly Fanning's point, and Margaret's made this as well. For the British government, it was all about Britain, right? I mean, like, all of these agreements are basically to try and get the Irish question off the table. Ultimately, this Council of Ireland notion, again, it comes out of this sort of imperial roundtable. We've tried something similar in the Cape in the wake of the Boer War, and that it's worked there, and perhaps it'll work in Ireland. But that presumes that you're going to have, partners in the Northern government and the Southern government who are actually willing to go along with it. And the Northern government makes it clear from day one they're not interested in participating in it. And I think it was a mutual recognition on the part of all three or the other two governments that it might as well just go into abeyance.
And during treaty negotiations, doesn't Collins make it plain that analogies with new entities in South Africa are, as far as he's concerned, absurd?
He does. He's very firm on that.
He does, but that doesn't mean that the British view changed. It's I think as well the question of I'm sorry, I lost my point. I'm gonna pause and great.
Okay, well, why did the Free State government impose a customs barrier in April 1920?
Looking for money.
Yeah, no, but in political,
one reason.
What they were doing was recognizing the border as it was, even before the Boundary Commission had been established.
Yeah. It was not a universally liked idea. One of the things, if you go into the Boundary Bureau papers, one of the more interesting characters who's doing a whole lot of research is Joe Johnston. And he's traveling around the communities and making economic analyses of what's happening. So I mean, it's a question in the inner circle: do we actually set up customs, and is it a mistake because of how it's going to be perceived? But I don't know, Mel. How do you read it?
I just read it as the Civil War blew such a hole in the finances. The Civil War basically cost 2 years worth of revenue in the Free State. Left it absolutely floored financially, economically. So I've always just seen it as desperate cash raising measure. But obviously, I mean, it completely undermined, their aspirations with the Boundary Commission.
Can't hear you, Tim.
Tim, you're muted.
You're muted.
I actually succeeded in muting myself and forgot to unmute. It wouldn't be a virtual group without that at least once.
Yeah.
So what I was saying is we've raised as many questions as we've answered, and I think that there's so much more to be done, frankly, to take us out of the realm of high politics, because the particularly for life along the border, both sides of the border, and the impact of it and the uncertainty of it, I think, is really the new direction we need to go in. But that would be maybe because I'm writing a book on it. That's why it's obsessing me. So.
I'd stick with we shouldn't forget the high politics side.
Oh,
Well,
But
sorry, Mel.
I was just going to say, so obviously, it was a debacle for Common and Gael and for the pro-treaty camp, and then you had Fianna Fáil established in 1926, making Irish unity one of its core aims. Fianna Fáil obviously goes on to dominate from 1932 onwards, and you get the sense that the question of partition becomes a kind of an issue of rhetoric, really, in Southern politics, and it's often forgotten. Of course, Common and Gael, when it voted to merge itself with the Centre Party and the Blue Shirts in 1933, it was initially known as the United Ireland Party as well. So the two big parties in the South, kind of did a lot of talking really about Irish unity and unification. But I suppose, as had been the case, we'd say prior to the treaty, during the treaty, and after the treaty, there was no real workable policy to bring that about.
Yeah. I mean, as far as the North was concerned, once you get to 1925, the progression has been so substantial. It's actually dangerous to be a member of Sinn Féin. To be a Republican, there's always the danger you'd be thrown in jail. So, people advocating a change in the border, or an Irish Republic, or even a United Ireland, real difficult. For election, campaigning was inconceivable in many areas. So it became difficult for a group in the North to relate to either of the parties in the Free State, because you were immediately being targeted by unionists and by the Spanish, who regarded any talk of Irish unity as disloyal, and it was impossible because of the legend that had been brought in to articulate anything about a United Ireland in political terms.
And I remember a couple of years ago, I was talking to Adrian Grant about some of this, and he was making the point, in the Republic, you had the Bureau of Military History, where obviously a wonderful oral history project, people coming forward to talk about their role in the revolutionary period. But for veterans in north of the border, to talk about their record, or to go on the record talking about their record, was completely unthinkable.
Well, it is. I mean, that book, there's a lot of stuff I did reading the Military Service Pensions Commission, and people in the North who were applying a pension, and it was mostly like for a pension. In many cases, they hand delivered their application.
Yeah.
They were afraid to post, and they also instructed the Irish government, do not post a letter telling me the result of my claim.
Yeah.
I haven't collected. There's a post. I will have a post box in the GO or whatever, and a letter to me with Irish government postmark on it. So it was so dangerous, because in order to get your military pension, you had to say what you had done, and you had to have referees who would say, indeed, done it. And they had to say who they were as well, and what their rank was. So
it would also be really interesting to know, people like Haughey's father, who was from whatever
Yes.
Swatra, and then he's in the Free State Army. Just how many people did, come down? Or I noticed Ewan O'Halpin was giving a paper about his relatives, his rice relatives from Down. Just how many from the north, from the nationalist north, did come down to the south in these years? I mean, it's quite a lot of people, I think.
Mm.
There's a lot of them pro-treaty, but then, of course, you've the large level of emigration of irregulars as well. But it just is. There are all kinds of strange social stories of displacement there that we don't really, as historians, have much access to, I don't think.
There's a
Or
lot
all
of
those
that
people
has to
like
be
the
done.
IRB guys from Tyrone, McCullough and McCartan and all of those, they all end up in Dublin, don't they? McCartan or someone end up in the States.
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot of work to be done on the number of refugees from Belfast and Lisburn who travelled south. Thousands, in fact, in 1992. When those in Belfast were at their height, their substantial numbers went south. And when Lisburn, all the businesses, Catholic businesses, were destroyed in 1920, and a substantial number of them moved south. Some of them set up business again in Dundalk and Newry, and then others moved south to Dublin. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done on actual numbers of refugees, how they're received in Dublin. Not all well in 1992.
And do we know much about Southern Unionists who moved up here?
Again,
well, there's
a lot of work to be done. We know thousands did particularly badly in Cavan and East Donegal. A lot of movement to the new state. Nigel Dodds, former deputy the DUP, his great grandparents moved north, I think, from Cavan to first to Fermanagh. Because many others, I mean, there's a guy Smith who was the MP for South Belfast. His family moved north, but these are only prominent people. But there were
so if I could jump in, one of the things
in Cavan and Monaghan in particular, and East Donegal, and a veil has been drawn over that.
What was that, Brian?
Some land was grabbed in Donegal.
Oh yeah, interesting.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting to bring it back to Craig just briefly, and then to Boundary Commission evidence as well. Craig would make the case throughout 21 and 22, especially when he was trying to get arms for the specials. He would talk about how uncomfortable it was for people on the border, on both sides of the border, who were known to be unionists, and he makes the comparison to the Balkans. I'm mindful of the Peter Hart controversy from years back, but he makes the comparison very distinctly in interviews in England to the displacement of peoples and the implied violence that is happening. Specifically in the Boundary Commission records, there's been a little bit of work done on this. Marie Coleman's referred to this, others as well. In Fermanagh, one of the bits of evidence that unionists offer is they call it a census of 2,000 or so Protestants who moved north and resettle, which is one of the reasons why, Margaret, I actually I chuckled when you were talking about all those seasonal workers coming across, and that's changing the electoral dynamics, because then they also plop down this list of 2,000 who supposedly have just moved in. But they're different, and what we need, a plug for anyone who has any influence on such matters, is the 1926 census report, because we desperately need to be able to assess some of these people as close as we can to the mid-20s.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, there were sort of unofficial land movements. I mean, there's a hugest in West Tyrone belonging to the Duke of Abercorn. Starts in Newton Stewart and went right into Donegal, right into East Donegal. And basically, after 1922, they simply gave up the part of the estate that was across the border in Donegal.
Who did they give it
because
to?
it wasn't safe to go there. It wasn't safe to try to farm it. They had plenty left, mind you. But
Sorry.
what happened? What happened that land?
Yeah.
So,
And there are all sorts of places like there's a salient at Castlederg.
yeah.
A nice triangle shape of land that goes in East Donegal, and a large number killed there by the IRA during the troubles in and around Castlederg, in that particular salient, and that was an area where there was real danger around the time of partition, for both sides, both nationalists and unionists.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very enjoyable.
Thank you. Great chat.